Welcome to this edition of Fuel for Thought. I'm Kristen Balasia, Vice President of Consulting Services at S&P Global Mobility. In today's episode of Fuel for Thought, we'll be talking about the North American International Auto Show, or the Detroit Auto Show. With the media days happening just last week, along with a notable visit from President Joe Biden and the public show, which is going on right now. And I'm pleased today to be joined by Mike Wall, Executive Director of Automotive Analysis, and Stephanie Brinley, Associate Director, Automotive Intelligence.
Hey, Kristen, thanks for having me today.
Hi, Kristen.
Absolutely. Hello. Stephanie, we'll start with you. For those that couldn't make it down to the show or maybe didn't take one of our tours, why don't we start by you just giving us a high-level overview of what we saw last week, who was there, and top points of interest or excitement?
Sure. This year we saw fewer automakers than we traditionally do. However, the hometown players were there. We saw Stellantis, we saw Ford, we saw GM have strong presences. We also saw Toyota have a pretty strong presence with a lot of new cars that they've got coming out this year. I noticed that if you look at Ford and Stellantis and GM and Toyota, that's about 77% of the registrations in Michigan. According to our registration data. So that does say that most of the cars that people buy, those brands were here and there. Subtle themes were internal combustion engine trucks and SUVs, and a lot of brands telling electric vehicle stories as they try to transition and prepare consumers for that.
That's great. And as I was thinking about this conversation today, I was thinking about the number of years that so many of us have said, is this going to be the end of auto shows, or are auto shows dead? And certainly they've changed. But Mike, I was going to ask you, in your view, what you saw, what you've seen and heard around the industry, are auto shows dead or dying, or are they really just experiencing a metamorphosis of sorts?
Yeah, I think it's the latter. They're evolving, and automakers are, they have a fixed pot of money, if you will, to spend on marketing and getting the story out there, and they're looking to prioritize that in any way possible. And yet you've got a dealer group, an engaged dealer group, that want to also make sure to showcase these vehicles. So what you're seeing is automakers really taking a look at their spend, if you will, and prioritizing that in a variety of ways. We saw some of that obviously on the ground in Detroit at this year's auto show, so it is an evolution. And you've got automakers going down other paths, doing some other more bespoke events on their own dime and on their own terms, and we'll see more of that. And we'll still see the show existing. It's just going to continue in evolution.
And it could really be a cool opportunity. I know this show through the last couple of years has thought about, how it might change or how it was going to change pre-COVID. And it could still be a good opportunity. And so, Stephanie, I'm curious, you mentioned the small handful of large brands that were there, but one thing we didn't see too much of was certainly just the breadth of brands we typically see, but also disruptor brands or anyone else using this as an opportunity to get more visibility in a national, potentially international stage. Why do you think that is?
I think there's a number of reasons for that. Detroit had changed its date a couple of times going through the last 2 years and COVID cancellations. So there seemed to be a little bit of hesitancy about when to commit and where to commit. That I think did dampen some of what we saw here. Another thing is that the Chinese automakers, which had at different times had really big displays at the Detroit Auto Show and have been there for several years off and on. They don't have as much traction right now, and frankly, they probably got more irons in the fire than trying to get to Detroit at the moment. And on the disruptors, I think when you look at a Tesla and Lucid and Fisker, they're Tesla doesn't appear in auto shows very much at all. Fisker and Lucid. Fisker has chosen to work in LA a little bit more, and part of that is being electric. Part of that's where electric cars are selling right now, and that's where that story is generating buzz for them. So I think those two things come into it a little bit. The disruptors not really using auto shows as much, and if they're doing it where the electric market is hot. And part of it has to do with the change in cadence of Detroit. I think it felt coming into this a little bit like we weren't sure what to expect. And I think automakers were a little bit hesitant too, to not sure what to expect out of the show.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And not only, like you mentioned, was it largely a hometown story, the look and feel of everything was short of a few, I'll call them rides that you could take, pretty muted compared to the past. And Mike, I thought it was kind of funny that, Carlos Tavares, the Stellantis CEO, actually said that they still plan on being in future shows, but only if they're cost effective. And he actually said, I think everybody now understands that the show is not made for the egos of the top executives in the industry. And I think back to what many of us have probably seen, where, and I think a lot of them were Stellantis, previous Stellantis brands that had, Celine Dion or Cirque du Soleil, Arnold Schwarzenegger, vehicles driving through glass, really quite kind of over the top events. And we certainly didn't see anything to that extent this time. So, what's your take on that, Mike?
No, I agree completely. It is very much about the vehicles. And at the end of the day, you could tell that was a theme. The money was spent on the vehicles as opposed to the booths, as it were, the displays. And if you're going to choose to prioritize your money and your spend, it's clear the automakers are focused on that. You still have to pay attention to how the vehicles are presented, and there's some that were better than others, no doubt. But by the same token, you could definitely see a prioritization there, and really a kind of a protection over that spending. We're on the cusp of a rapid deployment of electric vehicles. There's a lot of money being spent in the industry right now. So anytime you're spending a dollar, you've got to prioritize where that goes and what's the best use of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And Stephanie, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I agree with Mike that it was more about the cars this time, and Carlos's comments were definitely interesting. Um, the counter to that, I think, is you still have to celebrate the cars. You still have to tell a good brand story, and I'm not sure. I think that the Detroit automakers that were participating this year did that, but we also saw a number of vehicles that were put up by the dealerships that were there for consumers to see, but with very little story. And that's more confusing than it is helpful from a consumer level. And the other thing is that, the only one that's really going to make your brand important at the end of the day is yourself. So if you don't, then no one else will. And it also reminds me of sort of recession time period when we went through, everybody also having intense cost pressures, but also there was a lot of conversation at that point about let's not be too show-offy, right? This was also a thing in 2009 and 2010. And being at auto shows at that point, and as an example, seeing, one automaker who had opted to not necessarily put the money into the lights above the show floor, because it is pretty expensive. Everything's expensive. And they were across the way from another automaker who had lots of lights and lots of bright white cars. And the contrast of the stand with a lot less light and this other really bright stand was difficult as for a consumer. Like, you're like, okay, well, one is doing well and one thinks it's more important, and that's a contrast that doesn't play well. So I think that while you do have to do return on investment and you have to be careful about how you do that, then it also still has to be important, right? An example of kind of over the top, you mentioned Arnold Schwarzenegger. That was Mercedes-Benz in the Geländewagen reveal a number of years ago. They also had a Geländewagen in amber, encased in amber on the show floor. That was kind of crazy. It was a former version of Stellantis Jeep that drove the vehicle through the glass plate wall. It was Ram who had, steers and cows running down Washington Avenue in Detroit. Like, yeah, that sort of excess doesn't need to happen. But we do absolutely need to express your brand and show that that's important, because again, no one else is going to express that importance better than you will.
Hmm. Well, what I thought was interesting, one example of reinforcing a brand image in a relatively low cost way, Subaru, correct me if I'm wrong here, Stephanie, Subaru had that display when you walked in that was national parks and pretty, kind of a pretty simple display there, and then adopted animal. And who doesn't love puppies or dogs? There was a fenced off area with animals, right? So it reinforces
Yeah.
their love brand, their appeal to nature and animal lovers and things like that. And it wasn't a celebrity. It wasn't some giant display that probably cost millions to set up. But it really reinforced what they want you to feel about their brand.
It did. The Subaru stand has that's a smaller version than what they had in LA and New York, but it carried all the same themes. Subaru is love, and they definitely want to play up the national parks. They're, I think, the highest corporate donor to the U.S. national parks ever.
Mhm.
So it's pretty important to them. And the puppies. I mean, everyone loves the puppies. So Subaru has this really great little niche that to your point is perfect for their brand. You can do a more elaborate stage in some shows like they've done that is a little bit more layered, and it still has all the same themes though. Or you can do a smaller version like they did in Detroit and still carry the themes. And that would be a show stand that has been super successful in a number of markets and is a really good example of how you can scale it back if you need to, and you can raise it up in different shows if that's the environment that you need.
Yeah. And, we talk about what took up real estate while we were there. And we didn't see, Mike, as many vehicles at the show as we usually do, but we're not seeing as many vehicles anywhere as we usually do, right? So maybe you can give an update on that situation while we're here talking about cars that are out there trying to be socialized and sold as soon as people can get them, right?
Yeah, that was the subtle or not so subtle undercurrent with this. Is just the reality is there's still not a lot of inventory out there. So it's a challenge we're still wrestling with. Obviously, some of that was apparent at the show, just where there were some areas that were thinner than you would have normally noticed in the past because we just don't have as much product out there. Dealers were scrambling, very likely to get product. And that's a reality of what we're seeing on the ground today. If you go to dealers, inventory is improving month over month, quarter over quarter. So again, not to make it too negative a story, it is improving, but boy, it's slow. And it's indicative too of just we're still under supply chain constraints, we're under labor constraints, go down the list. And it's something we're going to be wrestling with. And we feel it's something that we're going to still be wrestling with into next year as well. We're estimating somewhere near as we go through into second quarter and exit second quarter, we'll start to get some even further improvement on inventory, meaningful improvement on that end. In terms of vehicle sales, this year we did just update our latest forecast, and our U.S. light vehicle sales forecast. We trimmed it a little bit. We're sitting at 14 million units for this year and 15.2 million units next year, and that's U.S. light vehicle sales. One of the things we'll be watching very closely next year. Again, near term, it's still very supply chain constrained, but as we look to next year and as supply chain constraints start improving, inventory starts to improve, we look at the condition of the consumer. And we start moving from a supply constraint environment to maybe more of a demand influenced environment. And that pulse of the consumers become even more important. So automakers are going to have some interesting waters to navigate next year from an incentive perspective, from a again, marketing and brand strategy perspective as they look to try to capture that customer next year and going forward.
Absolutely. Well, that's a light at the end of the tunnel. We just don't know exactly how long the tunnel is. So, Stephanie, you're out and about a lot,
Mhm.
and not just auto shows, but a number of different industry events. What do you see that's exciting in other ways OEMs are choosing to showcase new capabilities, launching new vehicles?
There's an emphasis on sort of more direct one-on-one events with the media, but the other thing that automakers are doing is teasing information out throughout the cycle and throughout the process. So we're seeing a lot more automakers tease out an image of the front bumper and a wait to see this and information about maybe what one trim package might sort of hold, and teasing the information out before they kind of pull the wraps off the vehicle. That's one of the things that's happening. I'm not sure how successful that's going to be over time because you really have to catch the person looking for the next utility vehicle, on a random Tuesday to get them to notice that news. It's
Hmm.
it's off base from a show, but we're seeing that sort of thing. And one of the examples that we have too is Cadillac Celestiq, the new Halo EV that is expected to be more than or around $300,000. They're taking a super focused approach and taking this vehicle to that 1% and putting it in the environment that the 1% seems that they feel like they want to do, because this is a vehicle that's going to compete with both Rolls Royces and with vacation homes. So we haven't seen that yet in person, like in terms of auto shows and sort of that. They're kind of trying to make it really targeted in that space. So it'll be interesting to see also from the media perspective, because media is has traditionally been part of the auto show and those reveals, in doing these throughout the year. I mean, just just Detroit alone in 2019 had about 44 product reveals, depending on how you count them. You try and do that throughout the year, and the media schedule gets kind of crazy. One thing that's good about auto shows is you put a stake in the calendar and say this
Hmm.
is when we're going to talk about it, and everybody focuses. So we'll be interesting to see how that's spreading out along the calendar year, if that's is as effective over time as they want it to be, and we just don't know.
Right. Yep. Time will tell.
Mhm.
So, Stephanie, I guess last question, and Mike, if you have a view too. Stephanie, I'll ask you, with everything that went on, and there was, a fair amount of things going on. What would be your biggest takeaway, though, about maybe what was different, or how would you sum up the show? And then I'm curious what your favorite thing was. And then, Mike, I want to know what your favorite thing was at the show too. So, Stephanie, I'll let you go with the wrap up of how you'd summarize the show.
Thanks. So, I love product. That's kind of why I'm here, and why I do this. And I grew up on this show, so it was very interesting for me to see it in the size and shape that it was. But one of the things that I took away from it really is we had brands telling excellent electric vehicle stories, and I said leading consumers to that future. But we also had a lot of really strong internal combustion engine products, and the dynamic nature of the market right now, the availability of things that consumers have to choose from, and seeing that kind of displayed in a really interesting way. I took away from that as a lot of positivity, really. We've got great products now. Internal combustion engines products they're not falling off a cliff tomorrow, even as we move into this EV future, and there's still plenty of life there. And seeing both of those side by side and seeing brands tell that story, I think was interesting. So I look for things like that. As far as my favorites, I really did like the Lincoln Star concept, which I saw in April, and now again in a different color in Detroit. But it's a gorgeous concept, and it's an expression of where Lincoln sort of sees their quiet flight going in electric space. One of the things that I liked about it, without getting into the specifics of the future features, is there's features in there that they expect they can put into production in 24 and 25, but there's other things that are in there they know the technology's not quite there yet, but they're like, one day we'll be able to do this thing. And so I think that's pretty terrific. The other one that I like just looking at, the Buick Wildcat concept I just thought was stunning. It was just really fun to look at. It would be nice if they do another sexy two-seat coupe like that, or two-door coupe like that.
That's great. Thanks. Mike, what about you? What was your
Yeah, for
favorite
me,
thing?
yeah, Steph's 100% right. I agree completely. That coexistence between EV and internal combustion was really striking and finally great to see, because, and part of that was enabled because we're starting to see a more rounded out lineup of EVs. So that was really cool to see that contrast, and just as a more of a, I think it was Alfred Sloan that coined a car for every person purpose, and that's really what this show was kind of striking on. Now, there's still a little bit of petrol running through my veins, so I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the Mustang reveal, and having that featured prominently. That was kind of cool to see, right alongside again a Mustang Mach-E and a Ford F-150 Lightning. And then you could go down the line and see the Hummer EV, and the cutaway they had of the Hummer EV was really striking, but right next to a Sierra Denali pickup truck that's traditional ICE. So it was really cool to
Right.
see that contrast and see the diversity of products on really both sides of the coin.
Great point. Great point. Well, thank you, Mike and Stephanie, so much. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We'll be back with more Fuel for Thought next month. To opt in to our newsletter that provides more information on this topic and others, please visit spglobal.com/mobility.